Thank you for joining Wars of the Rosies, and this is General Grand Lodge from the Encyclopedia of Freemasonry by Albert G. Mackey. General Grand Lodge. Ever since the Grand Lodges of this country began, at the commencement of the Revolutionary War, to abandon their dependence on the Grand Lodges of England and Scotland, that is to say, as soon as they emerged from the subordinate position of Provincial Grand Lodges and were compelled to assume a sovereignty and independent character, attempts have, from time to time, been made by members of the craft to destroy this sovereignty of the state Grand Lodges and to institute in its place a superintending power, to be constituted either as a Grand Master of North America or as a General Grand Lodge of the United States, led perhaps by the analogy of the United Colonies under one federal head, or in the very commencement of the revolutionary struggle, controlled by long habits of dependence on the mother lodges of Europe. The contest had no sooner begun, and a disseverance of political relations between England and America taken place, than the attempt was made to institute the office of a Grand Master of the United States, the object being, of which there can hardly be a doubt, to invest Washington with the distinguished dignity. The effort emanated, it appears, with the military lodges in the army. For a full account of it, we are indebted to the industrious researches of Brother E.G. Storer, who published the entire minutes of the American Union Lodge, attached to the Connecticut line, in his work on the early records of Freemasonry in the state of Connecticut. On the 27th of December, 1779, the lodge met to celebrate the day at Morristown, in New Jersey, which, it will be remembered, was then the winter quarters of the army. At that communication, at which, it may be remarked by the way, Brother Washington is recorded among the visitors, a petition was read representing the present state of Freemasonry to the several deputy Grand Masters in the United States of America, desiring them to adopt some measures for appointing a Grand Master over said states. The petition purports to emanate from ancient free and accepted Masons in the several lines of the Army, and on its being read, it was resolved that a committee be appointed from the different lodges in the Army and from the staff to meet in convention at Morristown on the 7th of February next. Accordingly, on the 7th of February, 1780, a convention, called in the records a committee, met at Morristown. This convention adopted an address to the Grand Masters of the several lodges in the respective United States. The recommendations of this address were that the said Grand Masters should adopt and pursue the most necessary measures for establishing one Grand Lodge in America, to preside over and govern all other lodges of whatsoever degree or denomination, licensed or to be licensed, upon the continent, that they should nominate as a Grand Master of said lodge a brother whose merit and capacity may be adequate to a station so important and elevated, and that his name should be transmitted to our Grandmother Lodge in Europe for approbation and confirmation. The convention contained delegates from the state of Massachusetts, Connecticut, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Delaware, and Maryland. Between the time of its conception, on the 27th of December, 1779, and that of its meeting on the 7th of February, 1780, that is to say, in January 1780, the Grand Lodge of Pennsylvania had held an emergent meeting, and in some measure anticipated the proposed action of the convention by electing General Washington, Grand Master of the United States. From the contemporaneous character of these events, it would appear that there was some concert of action between the Grand Lodge of Pennsylvania and the Masons of Morristown, perhaps the initiative having been taken by the latter in December, the former determined to give its influence in January to the final recommendations which were to be made in the following February. All this, however, although plausible, is but conjecture. Nothing appears to have resulted from the action of either body. The only further reference which I find to the subject in subsequent Masonic documents is the declaration of a convention held in 1783 to organize the Grand Lodge of Maryland, where it is remarked that another Grand Lodge was requisite before an election could be had of a Grand Master for the United States. But the attempt to form a General Grand Lodge, although on this occasion unsuccessful, was soon to be renewed. In 1790, the proposition was again made by the Grand Lodge of Georgia, and here, true to the Roman axiom, the Lodge of Pennsylvania became the opponent of the measure and declared it to be impracticable. Again, in 1799, the Grand Lodge of South Carolina renewed the proposition and recommended a convention to be held at the city of Washington for the purpose of establishing a superintending Grand Lodge of America. The reasons assigned by the Grand Lodge of South Carolina for making this proposition are set forth in the circular which it issued on the subject to its sister Grand Lodges. They are to draw closer the bonds of union between the different lodges of the United States and to induce them to join in some systematic plan whereby the drooping spirit of the ancient craft may be revived and become more generally useful and beneficial, and whereby ancient masonry, so excellent and beautiful in its primitive institution, may be placed upon such a respectable and firm basis in this Western world as to bid defiance to the shafts of malice, or the feeble attempts of any foreign disclaimers to bring it into disrepute. The allusion here is to the Abbé Barrel, who had just published his abusive and anti-Masonic History of Jacobinism. Several Grand Lodges acceded to the proposition for holding a convention, although they believed the scheme of a superintending Grand Lodge inexpedient and impracticable, but they were willing to send delegates for the purpose of producing uniformity in the Masonic system. The convention, however, did not assemble. The proposition was again made in 1803 by the Grand Lodge of North Carolina, and with a like want of success. In 1806, the subject of a General Grand Lodge was again presented to the consideration of the Grand Lodges of the Union, and propositions were made for conventions to be held in Philadelphia in 1807 and in Washington City in 1808, neither which was convened. The proceedings of various Grand Lodges in the years 1806, 1807, and 1808 contain allusions to this subject, most of them in favor of a convention to introduce uniformity, but unfavorable to the permanent establishment of a General Grand Lodge. North Carolina, however, in 1807 expressed the opinion that a National Grand Lodge should possess controlling and corrective powers over all Grand Lodges under its jurisdiction. An unsuccessful attempt was made again to hold a convention at Washington in January 1811 for the purpose of forming a superintending Grand Lodge of America. After the failure of this effort, the Grand Lodge of North Carolina, which seems to have been earnest in its endeavors to accomplish its favorite object, again proposed a convention to be convoked at Washington in 1812, but the effort, like all which had preceded it, proved abortive. No convention was held. The effort seems now, after all these discoursing attempts, to have been laid upon a shelf for nearly 10 years. At length, however, the effort for a convention, which had so often failed, was destined to meet with partial success, and one rather extemporaneous in its character was held in Washington on the 18th of March, 1822. Over this convention, which the Grand Lodge of Maryland rather equivocally describes as composed of members of Congress and strangers, the renowned orator and statesman Henry Clay presided. A strong appeal, most probably from the facile pen of its eloquent president, was made to the Grand Lodges of the country to concur in the establishment of a General Grand Lodge. But the appeal fell upon unwilling ears, and the Grand Lodges continued firm in their opposition to the organization of such a superintending body. The subject was again brought to the attention of the fraternity by the Grand Lodge of Maryland, which body, at its communication in May 1845, invited its sister Grand Lodges to meet in convention at Baltimore on the 23rd of September 1847 for the purpose of reporting a constitution of a General Grand Lodge. This convention met at the appointed time and place, but only 7 Grand Lodges were represented by twice that number of delegates. A constitution was formed for a Supreme Grand Lodge of the United States, which was submitted for approval or rejection to the Grand Lodges of the Union. The opinion expressed of that constitution by the Grand Lodge of Ohio, that it embraced, in several of its sections, indefinite and unmeaning powers to which it was impossible to give a definite construction, and it gave a jurisdiction to the body which that Grand Lodge would in no event consent to, seems to have been very generally concurred in by the other grand bodies, and the Supreme Grand Lodge of the United States never went into operation. The formation of its constitution was its first, its last, and its only act. The next action that we find on this, much discusses the subject, was by the Grand Lodge of New York, which body recommended in 1848 that each of the Grand Lodges should frame the outlines of a general grand constitution, such as would be acceptable to it, and send it with delegates to a convention to be held at Boston in 1850, at the time of meeting of the General Grand Chapter and Grand Encampment. The Committee of the Grand Lodge of New York, who made this recommendation, also presented the outlines of a General Grand Constitution. This instrument defines the jurisdiction of the proposed General Grand Lodge as intended to be over all controversies and disputes between the different Grand Lodges which may become parties to the compact. When such controversies are referred for discussion, and the decisions in all cases to be final when concurred in by a majority of the Grand Lodges present, and the decision in all cases to be final when concurred in by a majority of the Grand Lodges present. But it disclaims all appeals from state Grand Lodges or their subordinates in matters relating to their own internal affairs. It is evident that the friends of the measure had abated much of their pretensions since the year 1779, when they wanted a Grand Lodge of America to preside over and govern all other lodges of whatsoever degree or denomination, licensed or to be licensed on the continent. The Grand Lodge of Rhode Island also submitted the draft of a General Grand Constitution, more extensive in its details than that presented by New York, but substantially the same in principle. The Grand Lodge of the District of Columbia also concurred in the proposition. The convention did not, however, meet, for the idea of a Supreme Grand Lodge was still an unpopular one with the craft. In January 1850, Texas expressed the general sentiment of the fraternity when it said, "The foundation of a General Grand Lodge will not accomplish the desired end." The same feeling and spirit that now led to difficulties between the different Grand Lodges would produce insubordination and disobedience of the edicts of a General Grand Lodge. But another attempt was to be made by its friends to carry this favorite measure, and a convention of delegates was held at Lexington, Kentucky in September 1853, during the session of the General Grand Chapter and encampment at that city. This convention did little more than invite the meeting of a fuller convention, whose delegates should be clothed with more plenary powers, to assemble at Washington in January 1855. The proposed convention met at Washington and submitted a series of 9 propositions styled Articles of Confederation. The gist of these articles is to be found in the initial one, and is in these words: all matters of difficulty which may hereafter arise in any Grand Lodge or between 2 or more Grand Lodges of the United States, which cannot by their own action be satisfactorily adjusted or disposed of, shall, if the importance of the case or the common welfare of the fraternity demand it, be submitted, with accompanying evidence and documents, to the several Grand Lodges in their individual capacities, and the concurrent decision thereon of 2/3 of the whole number, officially communicated, shall be held authoritative, binding, and final on all parties concerned. The provisions of these articles were to be considered as ratified, and were to take effect as soon as they were approved by 20 Grand Lodges of the United States. It is needless to say that this approbation was never received, and the proposed confederation failed to assume a permanent form. It will be perceived that the whole question of a General Grand Lodge is here, at once and in full, abandoned. The proposition was simply for a confederated league, with scarcely a shadow of power to enforce its decisions, with no penal jurisdiction whatsoever, and with no other authority than that which, from time to time, might be delegated to it by the voluntary consent of the parties entering into the confederation. If the plan had been adopted, the body would, in all probability, have died in a few years of sheer debility. There was no principle of vitality to keep it together, but the friends of a General Grand Lodge did not abandon the hope of effecting their object, and in 1857 the Grand Lodge of Maine issued a circular urging the formation of a General Grand Lodge at a convention to be held at Chicago in September 1859. During the session of the General Grand Chapter and General Grand Encampment at that city, this call was generally and courteously responded to. The convention was held, but it resulted in a failure. Other attempts have been made by its friends to carry this measure, but with no results. Thank you for watching, and please don't forget to share, like, subscribe, and comment. And if you can, please consider donating to Wars of the Rosies. Links to PayPal and Patreon are in the description. Thank you so very much.